In the summer of 1874, the village of Courchevel fell quiet at dusk. Not because the workday ended or because prayers began, but because something was happening that should not have been. Just after the sun dropped below the hills, the bells at Saint Lisette Abbey began to toll. 3 soft notes, then silence, then 3 more. The pattern repeated for 7 nights. A sound once sacred now made children weep and dogs howl. The abbey had been shuttered for 9 years. No one had entered since the gates were chained in 1865 after the final sister was declared missing. No clergy remained. No candles had burned in its windows since the last snow of that year. But still, the bells rang. Some said it was the wind, though the ropes had been severed. Others claimed it was rats. But bells don't swing themselves, and no wind ever rang with rhythm. On the 8th night, the mayor sent 2 men to investigate. Both were retired soldiers, one with a missing eye, the other with burns up his right arm from the war. They were not afraid of silence or ghosts. But when they reached the front gate, they found the chains broken, not rusted or worn, but snapped clean through. Beyond the gate, the gravel was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, just cold stone and moss. Inside the chapel, the air hung with a smell like old soap and dried milk. The pews were all in place, the altar was intact. The belfry ladder was too rotted to climb. And yet the bells had been moved. They hung lower than before, their ropes newly tied with what looked like braided cloth. The dormitories were worse. In the east wing, 20 narrow beds sat in perfect rows. At the foot of each, a pair of shoes, black leather polished. On the pillows, small white crosses embroidered into the fabric, one on each. The sheets were tucked, folded with corners so precise they looked ironed. But there were no women, no bodies, no signs of struggle. On the windowsills, dust had gathered around spaces where candles once stood. 1 candle remained, half melted, as if only recently lit, with a wick that still carried the smell of wax and something faintly bitter. The wardrobe closets were full of garments. Linen habits hung neatly, underwear folded by color and size. But none of it had been touched by weather or time. No rot, no mold, no decay, as if someone had been caring for them or guarding them. In the kitchen, porcelain dishes were stacked, each bowl cupped inside another. A loaf of bread sat uncut on the counter, stale but intact, with no mold, no insects, no slice taken. The knife beside it was polished to a sheen. One investigator noted the sink was wet, but the plumbing had been disconnected for years. In the root cellar, they found a trapdoor sealed with 9 nails, each driven deep into the frame, their heads marked with ash. They did not open it. They would never speak of it again. By the 10th day, word had spread to the bishop's office in Nantes. 3 clergymen were sent, and they brought constables. This time the abbey was searched in full. No blood, no bones. But at the far wall of the belfry, behind a rotted tapestry, a message had been scratched into the stone. The words were barely legible, as if carved by hand or with fingernails. It read, "We were never alone in the hours after prayer. We gave her what she asked. She rang the bells so we'd be heard." After that, the bells were dismantled. The abbey was locked again. But this time, the doors were sealed with lead, and the surrounding walls reinforced with mortar. No one was allowed inside, not for prayer, not for study, not for grief. Saint Lisette became a place you did not look at when passing. Parents told their children not to ask about the sisters. And every year on the anniversary of the bells, the village holds no mass. No candle is lit, only silence. Because sometimes silence is safer. Sometimes silence is all we have left. They said she arrived on foot in the rain, carrying only a canvas satchel and a small wooden box. It was the spring of 1836 when Sister Constance took her vows at Saint Lisette, and was named abbess within the same month. The appointment was swift, too swift. Some whispered, but none dared question the bishop's choice. She was tall, with hands that stayed folded whether standing, sitting, or walking. Her voice was calm, never raised, and her smile came easy, though it never quite reached her eyes. In fact, she often smiled with her eyes closed. The younger sisters thought it was a form of prayer. The older ones knew it was something else. Her silence was heavy, not peaceful. Her footsteps were soft, not kind. She was not cruel, but she made cruelty seem pious. Discipline became her doctrine. The bell rang earlier. Meals were taken in complete silence. No idle chatter was permitted in the cloisters. If a novice laughed, even softly, Sister Constance would take her hand in both of hers, press a kiss to the knuckle, and whisper, "Laughter rots the root of obedience." Then she'd ask the girl to walk with her to the garden behind the kitchen. No one was allowed in that garden except her. It had once grown herbs, parsley, rosemary, and lavender, but within weeks of her arrival the soil had been dug up, leveled, and fenced. The gate was padlocked, the windows facing it painted shut. A new scarecrow was erected there, though no crows had been seen for years. The figure was dressed in linen and rosaries, and its hands, though no one said it aloud, looked too small to be stuffed. When asked why the garden was closed, she said simply, "Things grow wild without walls." And when one sister asked what was buried beneath the flattened soil, Constance replied, "Memory." That sister left the convent 2 days later. She was never seen again. Her room was the smallest in the abbey. Bare stone walls, one cot, no mirror. She slept with her door open and woke before the bell. But on her desk sat the wooden box she'd carried when she arrived. No one ever saw inside it, but some claimed they heard it clicking at night. Soft mechanical sounds like a music box struggling to play. Others swore they saw her dip her fingers inside it before morning prayer and lick them clean. One claimed to see her holding a child's tooth between her fingers before Mass. But she was never confronted, because when Sister Constance looked at you, she did not blink. And if she smiled, she did so with her eyes closed, as if savoring something you could not taste. She believed in silence not as absence, but as offering. She once tore the pipes from the organ because she said the sound invited arrogance into God's house. She replaced hymns with humming and humming with stillness. The sisters were taught to confess without speaking, to show remorse with the body. One broke her own finger in front of her after breaking fast too early. Constance had only nodded and told her, "You have remembered your spine." After that, others followed. Bruises became ritual. Cuts were treated with salt. And when asked if it was penance, she said no. It is devotion made visible. No complaints were ever recorded. No outsider was ever invited in. But deliveries began to change. Bakers noted that the abbey no longer ordered flour, only salt. The butcher was told not to bring meat but bones, clean, marrowless. And most chilling of all, the town's midwife was once summoned, not for a birth but for a removal. She returned pale and silent, never setting foot near the abbey again. By winter, the sisters no longer laughed. They smiled like Constance did, eyes shut, hands folded. The garden gate stayed locked, and every evening she stood at the window above it, murmuring to herself, watching the scarecrow sway in windless air. Whatever was buried there, whatever roots she trimmed and rebent, it was not forgotten. Not by the land, not by the walls, and certainly not by the ones who followed her. They found it sealed behind the altar during the first state inspection of Saint Lisette in 1875, a year after the bells tolled for no one. The inspector, a young archivist named Delon, was cataloging the chapel's cracked stonework when he noticed a slight draft behind the crucifix. It was not air exactly, but coldness, damp and still like the breath of something waiting. Beneath the crumbling mortar, tucked into a hollow cavity just large enough for a hand, was a leather-bound book wrapped in oilcloth. Its cover bore no title, only a smear of soot and the faint imprint of a palm, pressed there with such force it had left bone-deep ridges. The book had no index, no introduction, no prayer, just pages, dozens of them. Yellowed, brittle, and smudged with fingerprints that never quite faded. Every page was marked the same way, an initial, a date, and a symbol drawn in the same hand. The symbols were not decorative. They were not crosses, nor flowers, nor any liturgical motif. They resembled anatomy, imperfect sketches of ribs, single teeth, droplets that could have been water or blood. On some pages a tiny braid was drawn, looped in a figure 8. On others the shape of a nail, sometimes bent. The initials never repeated, but the dates did. Repeated across years, always late winter, always the month of Lent. Some pages were stained, though not by ink. One bore the pattern of tears or melted wax. Another had a faint indentation as if pressed by something sharp and circular. But no page held more than a few lines. There were no full names, no explanations. Just the ledger. Near the middle of the book was a single anomaly, an entry from 1842, the name Marguerite R., written in a child's slanted hand, crossed out violently, ink scored so deep it tore the parchment. Beneath it, in finer script, was a new entry. Senior Elian, followed by the date and the symbol of a molar. The ink was wet enough to bleed through to the next page where no writing appeared. That year, convent records noted the sudden entry of a new novice, despite no evidence of sponsorship. That same year, a girl from the Rousseau estate disappeared during a church retreat. Her name had also been Marguerite. The book offered no guidance, no conclusions, only the slow, precise tallying of names that no longer existed. Offerings, it seemed, quiet ones, traded or taken, chosen or replaced. No ink ever suggested cause of death. But certain symbols repeated after specific names, like the rib sketch that followed 4 different sisters, all known to have vanished before their 2nd year. Or the thorn-shaped curl drawn after a novice named Lisa, who had once confessed to another sister that she dreamed of her own funeral. The ledger was not hidden because it was shameful. It was hidden because it was sacred, at least to whoever kept it. A record not of sins but of substitutions. Something was being fed. Something was being balanced. Life for silence. Obedience for memory. And always a name given where another had once been. The final pages were blank save for one. An unfinished entry, only a date, March 12, 1874. No name, no symbol, just a single drop of dark brown dried in the corner. Later tests would confirm it was not ink. Delon, the archivist, was never able to reproduce the symbols. He claimed the moment he looked away from them, he forgot what they meant. Like a language that vanished mid-thought. He tried copying them, but said the pen would not move right. His hand shook. His wrist burned. He stopped trying after one night when he woke to find his teeth loose and bleeding on the pillow. The book was sealed again, returned to the wall, not because the church wanted to hide it, but because no one wanted to know what more it might have remembered. Quiet offerings, it was called, not lost, not stolen, just given. Just enough to keep the bells from ringing. Just enough to be heard by something that listened in silence. She arrived in the fall of 1843, her hands wrapped in silk and her eyes fixed low as if seeing something the rest of the world no longer deserved. Sister Madeleine was not born to devotion. She had been a pianist in Marseille, a girl of velvet gloves and long afternoons by the window, waiting for a man in uniform who never returned. Her fiancé, Lieutenant Valois, had died in the summer campaign. They said his remains were never found whole. After the letter came, She stopped speaking. Her family claimed she burned her piano piece by piece and walked barefoot to Saint-Lisette. No carriage, no escort, just footsteps in the mud and a silence that no mourning could break. At first, the sisters admired her resolve. She was quiet, obedient, and never questioned. But she did not sing. She did not cry. During evening prayer, her lips moved, but no sound passed. She sat in the chapel for hours after the others had gone. They thought it was grief. They were wrong. By winter, the change had begun. Her walk became uneven. At first, a slight hesitation, barely visible, then a limp. She said nothing of it, not even when she could no longer rise without holding on to the pew. During Vespers, when the others knelt, she remained upright. Her hands stayed folded, her face blank. Her eyes never blinked. The sisters assumed illness, maybe a joint infection, until one morning when Sister Eloise caught sight of Madeleine changing her stockings. There were no kneecaps. Where they should have been, the skin dipped inward, forming unnatural hollows. The flesh had healed clean. There were no stitches, just two symmetrical pits where the bones had once anchored. When asked what had happened, she did not panic. She only smiled, not with joy but with finality, and said, "They were removed to atone for pride." She spoke as if describing a haircut, not a mutilation. No one knew what to say. Some thought she was mad. Others began to whisper about the locked garden again, about Sister Constance and her belief that remorse must leave a mark. But no one asked questions out loud, not in that place. After that day, Madeleine was never seen sitting again. She stood through every hour of prayer. She stood through meals, her tray untouched. She stood in the garden courtyard through rain and cold, her veil dripping, her legs trembling but never bending. At night, some sisters said they heard music, a soft keening sound, not from the chapel but from beneath the floorboards, like fingers brushing ivory, like songs played by memory alone. In the weeks that followed, other sisters began limping, small injuries, swollen joints, bruises shaped like fingers on their thighs. No one confessed, no one resisted. The silence became heavy. At mealtimes, the scraping of spoons echoed like screams. Constance said nothing. She only watched. She stood behind Madeleine in chapel and placed one hand gently on her shoulder. A gesture of comfort, it seemed. But her fingers lingered, and her eyes never closed during prayer. Sister Madeleine was last seen on March 12, 1844. Her bed was made, her shoes placed neatly beneath it. But her veil was found folded inside the wooden box on Constance's desk. Beneath it, two small bones, pale and polished, the right and left patella, identical in weight. A perfect set. Her name was never spoken again. The piano room remained locked, but the keys were never silenced. Late at night, when the wind rolled across the hills, the village swore they could hear her playing. No notes, just rhythm, like footsteps pacing a stone floor without end. The first to notice it was a maintenance boy sent from the village to sweep cobwebs and polish pews in the early days of Lent, 1845. He was no older than 15, broad-shouldered and sunburnt from farm work, with little interest in sacred things. But what he saw made him leave his broom in the chapel and run back down the hillside without collecting his pay. The stone altar, once smooth and gray, was slick with something wet, clear at first glance but sticky, sharp on the tongue. Brine. A slow ooze of salt water bleeding from its base, leaving behind white-crusted trails that hardened like tears drying on skin. The sisters dismissed the boy's panic. Stone absorbs weather, they said. Condensation. The Abbey had stood for centuries. It sweated in summer, it wept in winter. But the boy insisted it was salt. He showed the stain on his shirt where he had wiped the altar, stiff and pale like frostbite. The groundskeeper went up the next morning and returned without a word. The next week, he was replaced. Over the following months, the salt began to spread. The hymnals closest to the altar grew stiff, their pages curling inward, their bindings crackling with thin layers of white crust. The sacred water font dried out, replaced by thick mineral rings. Even the crucifix above the altar dulled and began to flake, the iron beneath corroding from salt that hadn't come from sea air. Saint Lisette was hundreds of miles from the coast. There was no seawater in its wells. No one had brought it. But it was there all the same, growing from the stone, soaking upward as if something deep below the floorboards had begun to leak. One nun, Sister Thérèse, collapsed during prayer. Her hands were blistered raw, the skin on her fingertips shriveled and pale as though she'd been submerged in salt water for hours. Her fingernails cracked when touched. She could no longer hold a rosary. The physician summoned from the next parish examined her and wrote in his report that her condition resembled that of fishermen lost at sea. Advanced osmotic decay of the soft tissues, but without exposure. He was disturbed enough to petition the bishop. The bishop came in person, a solemn man in his 60s with no tolerance for superstition. He walked the chapel. He touched the hymnals. He examined the crusted lip of the font and studied the streaks along the altar's base. Then he called it ascetic performance, a display of piety meant to humble the sisters. They starved the flesh, so now they salt it, he said. It is no different than flagellation. He left that afternoon and told the physician not to return. But salt kept coming. It formed in corners, in the crooks of the stone, on the windowsills. One morning, the confessional curtain was found stiff with salt crust, and inside the wooden kneeler had cracked open from within. When the sisters tried to remove the damaged pew, it splintered at the base. Inside, buried in the hollow wood, were scraps of cloth and something that looked like a handkerchief, soaked through and still wet, though no one had entered the chapel that night. The cloth bore initials no one recognized, A.M., stitched in red thread. Sister Constance offered no explanation. She only instructed the sisters to begin boiling water before use. Salt, she said, was a purifier. Where flesh is weak, salt will remember, she told them. The altar was never replaced. The chapel was never closed. Instead, the salt was accepted. It became part of the ritual. The sisters dipped their fingers in it before prayer. They stirred it into broth. They used it to clean their wounds. They said it kept them holy. No one remembered when the bleeding stopped. Only that the smell of the sea had long since vanished. Only that the floor had gone dry. And in its place, silence, as if something had been fed, as if the chapel had wrung itself clean. The wine cellar beneath Saint Lisette had always been considered the lowest part of the abbey, its stone walls cold enough to numb fingertips, its air still as breath held too long. Few sisters were ever sent down there after 1840, when the last casks were moved out and the door was bolted with a wooden beam too thick for one person to lift alone. For years it remained sealed, used only for storage and rarely spoken of, though some novices swore they heard the sound of dripping on quiet nights, like something still fermenting in the dark. When the abbey was inspected in 1875, the constables forced the cellar door open and found nothing unusual. Just dust, collapsed shelves, the smell of long-rotted cork and chalky mold. But in the corner, behind a rack of discarded crates, one of the floor stones sat uneven. When they pried it loose, it revealed a second stair beneath, and beneath that a third, twisted, narrow, spiraling downward like a rib cage swallowed into the earth. The stairs led to a hollow chamber carved directly into the stone foundation. It wasn't large, barely wide enough for 5 people to stand shoulder to shoulder. But it had the shape of a chapel, with an arched ceiling, a central recess, and 4 alcoves cut into the walls like crude shrines. The walls themselves were marked in chalk, not in handwriting but in geometric strokes, loops, squares with curled corners and repeating symbols that looked like eyes turned sideways or rib bones drawn in threes. Most disturbing of all were the shallow indentations carved into the stone itself, about 4 feet up the walls. Human-shaped, but not full figures. Just partial impressions, the slope of shoulders, the swell of a torso, the soft curve of a chin, 20 of them smoothed by time, as if someone had pressed against the walls again and again until the stone gave way to the memory of flesh. In the center of the room sat a low basin made of blackened copper, oxidized and pitted but still intact. Inside it was a liquid that appeared solid at first, thick, unmoving. But when stirred with a gloved hand, it shifted. Not water, not oil, something denser with the color of spoiled milk tinged at the edges with ink. The smell was faint but not sour. It was sweet, like milk just turning, like something kept alive too long in the dark. Later analysis confirmed the fluid contained calcium, blood traces, and something unidentifiable, an organic compound that did not match any substance on record. Some believed it was a ritual mixture. Others said it was curdled memory bled from the bodies of those pressed into the walls. But no official theory was ever released. The basin was drained, sealed in a crate, and taken to Paris. The crate never arrived. The chalk symbols were scrubbed, but the indentations remained. One inspector, a skeptic by nature, pressed his palm into one of the carved shoulders as a joke. He said he felt heat, said he heard something. A low exhale like air escaping from a place it didn't belong. That man left the church within the year. Died alone, blind in one eye with scratches along his back he claimed came from his own hands. When the chamber was resealed, the workers poured concrete down the 3rd stair until it hardened. But some of them refused to finish the job. One of the masons said the stairs breathed, that when he knelt to pour, he felt moisture on his neck as if something behind him whispered, "Do not replace what was offered." The wine cellar has not been reopened, but the stone above the sealed stair still appears damp even in winter. And when the wind shifts, those walking the halls above say they smell something faint and sour like spoiled milk on cloth. And behind that, just for a moment, the sweetness of something that once lived and chose to remain. Easter of 1844 fell late that year after a long, frost-bitten Lent that left even the orchard trees bare of blossom. The villagers of Courchevel expected the usual procession from Saint-Lisette, white-robed sisters singing Latin hymns as they walked the dirt path down into town, baskets of bread and jam passed out in silence. But that spring, the convent remained shuttered. No bells rang, no hymns echoed across the valley, and yet just after dusk, candlelight flickered in every window of the abbey. The refectory glowed brightest. Word spread that the sisters were holding their Easter feast in secret. 2 visitors had been invited to attend, an elderly nun from a neighboring convent, and a postulant's guardian who had donated generously to the church. Both were seated near the chapel, but kept from wandering. They later told conflicting stories, but in one detail they agreed. The sisters gathered at the long table without food, no loaves, no cheese, no wine. The table was bare save for plates and cups made of old tin, each one worn and darkened. Sister Constance stood at the head, eyes closed, hands pressed to her chest. Behind her, a single empty chair remained vacant. When the sisters sat, they bowed their heads and placed their napkins in their laps with slow precision. Then they began to eat, each of them miming the act with exquisite control. Forks rose and fell, hands tore invisible bread, jaws moved in slow, measured bites, as though chewing something dense and sacred. They swallowed, even sipped from empty cups. One sister dabbed her lips with a dry cloth, then smiled faintly as if tasting honey. No one broke character. Not one eye drifted from the ritual. It went on for hours. The visitors sat frozen. They were not offered food. They were not acknowledged. The elderly nun tried to speak, but Sister Constance raised one finger to her lips without looking, and the old woman felt her mouth lock shut as though pressed from within. She later said it was not fear she felt, but shame, as if I had spoken during someone else's funeral. That same evening, a novice named Odile, just 16, fled barefoot into the woods. She reached the village with torn feet and wild eyes, unable to speak. Her mouth bled down her chin. The town physician examined her and found her tongue had been partially sliced down the middle, split like a serpent's, the edges raw but not bleeding. The wound was too clean to be accidental. She would never speak again. When questioned by the bishop, Sister Constance claimed the girl had been purifying her voice. No charges were filed. No visitors were allowed again. After Easter, the kitchen remained cold. Bread deliveries were turned away. The oven, once kept warm year-round, was scrubbed and sealed. Sisters were seen carrying empty baskets into the courtyard, bowing before the locked garden gate. One dropped something into the dirt behind it, a tooth, some said. Others claimed it was a pebble carved with letters, but no one approached to check. Within weeks, other sisters stopped eating altogether. They still came to the refectory. They still sat, still chewed, still smiled. But the food was gone. Meals became mime. Hunger became devotion. The body, they were taught, was meant to remember suffering, and memory required practice. By midsummer, the orchard bore fruit again. The trees were heavy, but none were picked. One priest asked why they didn't harvest. Constance answered without expression, "We are fed elsewhere now." No one asked what she meant, not after what happened to Odile, not after what the visitors saw, because hunger is easier to endure than knowing what's truly being consumed. Madame Rousseau was a woman of precision. Her gloves were always stitched in matching thread. Her servants never spoke twice, and her daughters, two born 7 years apart, were raised to mirror one another down to the curl of their hair and the lilt in their step. The first Marguerite died young, taken by fever before her 9th birthday. The second was born a year later, and her name was given without pause, without grief, as though the loss had been overwritten. Marguerite again. Marguerite always. In the summer of 1846, the second Marguerite was sent to Saint Lisette Abbey. She was 17, soft-spoken, with a nervous tremor in her right hand that worsened when she tried to write. The convent accepted her without delay. Her mother received no reply at first, no confirmation, no acknowledgement. Then 3 months later, a letter arrived. Its parchment was thick, the ink slightly smeared at the edges. It bore no seal, only a stamped initial, C. The note inside praised Marguerite's obedience. It said she had returned to her nature and that she had remembered her original purpose. Madame Rousseau read it twice, then again aloud. The phrasing was odd. Returned, remembered. The more she read, the more unsettled she became. The signature at the bottom was not Sister Constance's, nor any name she recognized. Just a mark, what looked like a looped braid drawn in red wax, almost like a child's attempt at ribbon. Her unease deepened. That very night, she went into the attic and pulled out a small keepsake box untouched for a decade. Inside were locks of the first Marguerite's hair, her baptismal record, and a death certificate issued and signed. No mistakes, no questions. The child had died in 1836. Yet the language in the letter seemed to speak not of the living daughter, but of the one long buried. Madame Rousseau sent a reply by carriage. She asked how Marguerite was adjusting. She included new linens, prayer beads, and a note written in the daughter's own cipher. A simple substitution code the two had shared since childhood. The reply came 2 weeks later. It thanked her for the offerings. It said Marguerite no longer required worldly comforts. It included no mention of the cipher, no reference to their shared secret. Only a sentence near the bottom, written in a firmer hand. "We do not keep what has already been given." That winter, Madame Rousseau traveled to the Abbey gates. She brought no footman, no carriage marked with the family crest. She dressed as a midwife, face covered, hands gloved. She asked to see her daughter. She was told there was no novice by that name. When she insisted, one of the older sisters brought out a registry book. She pointed to an entry from 10 years prior. Marguerite Rousseau. Date of entry, 1836. No mention of a second girl. The name had never been recorded twice. She went home in silence. A month later, she attempted to exhume the first Marguerite's grave, but the village priest forbade it. Disturbing the dead was a sin, especially when the dead had been mourned, named, and buried properly. She tried again the following spring, only to find the grave sealed with fresh mortar, the headstone newly engraved, "She has returned." No one in Courchevel ever saw Madame Rousseau again. The family estate was shuttered within the year. Some say she went mad. Others believe she tried to retrieve her daughter a final time, alone and unblessed. But the convent denied all visits. And within the abbey walls, a young sister was seen sweeping the inner cloister, her right hand trembling slightly whenever she held a pen. She introduced herself as Marguerite, but when asked her full name, she hesitated just for a breath and replied, "I've had many." The hearth in Saint Lisette's main hall had always burned hotter than it should. Even in mild seasons, its flames roared with a windless hunger, licking up the flue without smoke, without ash drifting back down. The sisters said it was a gift, that the fire was faithful, that it kept the cold from nesting in their bones. They fed it constantly. No meal passed without logs, no vigil without coals, no punishment without embers smoldering beneath the silence. And for nearly a decade, the wood came from the forest edge, cut by a solitary woodsman named Remy, who delivered it without entering the grounds. He said he didn't need coin, only distance. But in the winter of 1847, Remy stopped coming. The wagons sat untouched, the hearth dimmed, the sisters bundled in shawls during matins, breath fogging in front of their veils. It was then that Sister Léonie was sent to inquire. She returned alone, clutching her rosary so tightly the beads left imprints in her palm. The woodsman, she said, would no longer serve them. When asked why, she only repeated, "He found what was buried." The truth did not come from the abbey. It came from Remy himself, drunken, tear-streaked, speaking to no one in particular at the village tavern, loud enough for the priest to hear. He had gone to cut new kindling from the copse near the old logging path, the same grove that backed the convent wall. There he found an abandoned cart. Not rusted, not overturned, just parked and forgotten. And inside it, bundled in fraying linen, were bones, small, delicate, not animal, human. 10 in total. Fingers, each one bound at the joint with red twine tied in intricate loops. And each bore something inside, threaded straight through the marrow, rosary beads, darkened with age, embedded so cleanly it looked as though they had grown there. The village priest investigated quietly. The bones were real, the twine was recent. And the rosary beads? One matched a strand known to have belonged to Sister Eliane, missing since 1842. Another bore a carved M, just like the initials stitched into a discarded garment found near the stables years earlier. Marguerite, the girl who had many names. When questioned by church officials, Sister Constance answered with calm certainty, "What the fire does not purify, the earth rejects," she said. "The bones are not ours to mourn." She offered no denial, no apology, only scripture. She spoke of sacrifice as the warming of the soul's coldest parts. She said fingers were symbols of action, and inaction must be cauterized. The hearth itself was opened soon after, the brick behind it partially removed. What they found was not a flue, but a hollow space packed with soot and twine. Dozens of small niches had been carved into the wall, narrow cavities no wider than a candle. In each, a finger, a bead, a name etched in chalk. The chalk had faded but not disappeared. The oldest name read Clémence, 1837, the most recent Odile, 1844. Her tongue had been split. Her hands had not been found until now. The room was sealed again, not by law but by fear. The fireplace remained cold from that day forward. A new stove was installed in the kitchen, iron and quiet. The sisters said nothing. They walked the halls with their hands folded, their sleeves drawn tight. But in the years that followed, the twine returned. Loops found in the corners of rooms tied around gateposts. Dangling from the refectory rafters, always red, always empty. Some say the hearth still breathes in winter, that if you press your hand against its stone, it feels warm, not with fire, but with memory, as though something inside is still waiting to be fed or forgiven. By 1851, the Abbey's reliance on outside deliveries had dwindled to near nothing. Bakers were no longer summoned. Seamstresses were told not to return. Even the candlemakers, who for decades had shaped pale wax into votives for the chapel, were turned away without explanation. The sisters insisted they had begun producing their own. Self-sustained by Providence, they wrote in a letter that bore no signature. Yet the village shopkeeper recalled how each week a cloaked figure would come before dawn to purchase raw beeswax in large, unmarked sacks. Always exact coin, always silent. When he asked which sister she was, she simply lowered her head and whispered, "The one who remembers." Over time, villagers began to notice something odd in the candles returned from the Abbey, those used up and donated back to the church or accidentally misplaced. The wax was too dark. It burned slower than any they'd made, and the wicks were never fully consumed. They curled inward, blackened like scorched hair, and left a scent behind. Not of oil or flame, but of something faintly sweet and sour underneath. Like honey left too long in a closed room. No one could say why they smelled it in their sleep. Then came the fire. In the autumn of 1875, following the investigation into the Abbey's disappearance, inspectors found the north storage room reduced to ash. The walls were scorched, the beams above blackened but still standing. The fire had not spread, contained entirely within the chamber, as if lit and left to burn itself out. Among the debris, buried beneath charred shelves and collapsed stone, was one object untouched by flame. A single candle, short, stubby, its edges warped but unburned. The wick curled but not lit. Its surface was carved, not ornamentally, not with holy signs, but with tiny, precise markings, as if someone had used a blade to etch letters while the wax was still warm. The candle was taken to the bishop's office in Nantes, placed under lock and key. Months later, a translator was summoned, not because the language was foreign, but because the words seemed fragmented, broken mid-thought, rearranged like stammered breath. It took hours to reconstruct. The message carved in the wax read, "She makes us cut what cannot be healed. She says the wound is the proof that we were born to be reduced. I watched her clean the blade in milk. I watched her mark the smallest ones first. I said nothing. I said nothing. I said nothing." No name was given, no date marked, but the wax matched the type once sold to Saint Lisette in 1848. A small batch, 9 sacks purchased by a woman whose name was never offered and never asked for. The handwriting of the wax carvings, compared to old convent letters, bore resemblance to that of Sister Thérèse, the same sister who had collapsed with salt-ravaged hands. No other candles like it were found, but others began to look. In nearby parishes, priests examined old wax from donation boxes. In Courchevel, a child found a stub of candle hidden inside a pew drawer, hollowed out, with something rattling inside. It was a tooth, human, milk-white and smooth, wrapped in a strip of parchment that had melted into the inner wax like skin pressed against flame. The church ordered all candles from Saint Lisette destroyed, but they burned slowly, resisting the match. Some let off faint screams, high-pitched and nearly imperceptible, like steam from boiling blood. The sisters, of course, were gone, but their wax remained, their carvings, their remnants. It is said now that a true confession must be written in permanence, not on paper, not in air, but in flesh, or flame, or wax, something that melts but never forgets. And in the quietest moments of a dying candle, when the wick trembles and the pool darkens, some claim to hear whispers in the flame, words etched long ago by hands too obedient to resist, words that were never meant to be spoken aloud. By 1857, Saint Lisette had become a place spoken of carefully, as one speaks of wounds that never healed. Few from the church visited uninvited, and even fewer returned unchanged. But that summer, Bishop Allard, stern, youthful, devout, announced he would observe the Abbey's rites personally. He had heard rumors, fanciful things, rituals with no Eucharist, nuns who walked barefoot on glass, a refectory where food never touched the tongue. He believed in correction, in the authority of doctrine. He arrived in full vestments, escorted by 2 clerics and a page. The sisters welcomed him with open doors and bowed heads. None met his eyes. On the first evening, as the bishop knelt to pray in the outer cloister, he heard it, humming. Faint, delicate, impossibly coordinated. A chorus of voices, not in Latin, not in words at all, but in tones that resonated deep in the chest. It moved like breath through reeds, weaving in and out of harmony, rising and falling in slow waves. The bishop later described it as the sound a soul might make if it had no mouth to scream. It seemed to echo without source, circling the chapel walls, drifting just beneath hearing. That same night he attended evening choir. The sisters gathered in formation, 20 of them robed in white, candles lit in their palms. Sister Constance did not stand with them. She observed from the apse, eyes open, lips parted as if mid-prayer. The candles flickered. The choir began, but no one sang. The bishop waited. A minute, then 2. The sisters raised their chins, opened their mouths, and stood silent. No voice emerged, no hymn was sung. But their mouths moved, slow and identical, as if reciting something unspeakable. Their lips trembled, but not with sound. When one candle blew out, the sister holding it did not blink. Her mouth remained frozen mid-phrase, as if stitched there by force. The next morning, the bishop demanded an explanation. None was offered. The cloister had gone still. Sister Constance was nowhere to be found. The bishop left before noon, his letters from that day curt and shaken. He never visited another convent again. Years later, during the post-abandonment investigation of 1875, a journal was discovered behind a loose stone in the infirmary wall. It belonged to Sister Joelle, a novice presumed lost during the winter of 1858. The entries were uneven, frantic, some written in the margins of hymns. One passage stood out, scratched into the paper with such pressure the page tore. "We were told that the voice is a prideful flame, that God hears what is felt, not what is heard. But she listens for breaches. She walks among us when we sing. She smiles when we forget the verse, but not when we speak above our place." The first to be corrected was Sister Camille. Her lips were open too wide. We found her mouth sewn shut with thread so fine it glittered. Gold, she said. She tried to hum but bled instead. The journal included no accusations, no plea for rescue, only observations. A list of those silenced. Some names crossed out, others circled. A drawing of lips bound in fine lines, each stitch marked with numbers. The gold thread was never found. But behind the organ, disassembled and abandoned, the investigators found a small pouch, cloth, hand-stitched. Inside it, 3 tiny needles flecked with dried blood and a spool of metallic thread thin as a hair, cold even in the sun. To this day, no recordings exist of Saint Lizette's choir. But some who walk the chapel ruins late in the year, when the frost tightens the wood and the wind moves slow, claim they hear it. Not song, not speech, just the soft hum of something mourning its right to be heard. A choir still practicing, mouths still sealed, devotion bound in silence that cut deeper than sound ever could. The letter arrived without a stamp, without a seal. Folded into thirds, stained at one corner, it was hand-delivered by a barefoot boy who claimed he'd been paid with a coin wrapped in linen. The envelope was addressed only to the bishop's office in Nantes. No return name, no indication of who had written it. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the message inside was legible, painfully so. A list of names, 20 in all, written in the precise cursive style taught in novitiate. Some were familiar, others had been presumed dead for years, and beneath the final name, a single line. Tonight we return what was never ours. The letter was dated March 12, 1874. By morning, the bell tower at Saint Lisette had collapsed. The villagers heard it before they saw it. A groan in the night, deep and drawn, like timber splitting underwater. Then came the crash, low and thick, a sound that rolled across the hills like thunder too close to the earth. When they reached the Abbey at dawn, the rest of the structure stood untouched. The chapel windows remained unbroken. The dormitory doors were latched from within. But the bell tower lay in ruin, its stones scattered across the cloister, the bronze bell itself half buried in the soil, cracked down the center as if struck by something larger than sound. And there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no fire, no blood. Inside the convent, the beds were made. Candles sat unlit in their holders. The refectory was clean, dishes stacked. The piano bench in the prayer hall was pushed in neatly, though the keys bore faint fingerprints in ash. On each pillow in the dormitory sat a folded strip of cloth, white and narrow, like a tongue pressed flat. Every pair of shoes rested beside its corresponding bed, polished to a shine. The locked garden gate was open. In the soil, newly overturned, 20 rosary beads were half buried, each attached to a finger bone wrapped in red thread. The church ordered the grounds to be sealed immediately. No official statement was made. No search conducted. The villagers were told the sisters had been relocated to a retreat, that the tower's collapse had been structural, that the loss, though regrettable, was a natural end to a quiet chapter. But no one believed it. Not after the humming, not after the bells. The truth was buried deeper than the stone. The letter remained locked in the bishop's private archives, but a clerk who transcribed it remembered one odd detail. The ink used to write the names had shimmered faintly in candlelight, not like wetness, but like pearl. It smelled faintly of salt, and the names, when read aloud, seemed to echo softly beneath the breath, as though someone else was whispering them back. Some believed the sisters had left in silence, as they had lived. Others believed they had offered themselves, willingly, ritually returned what was never theirs. But what that meant was never clarified, not in writing, not in legacy, only in absence. Years later, when workers were sent to stabilize the remaining structure, they found something beneath the chapel floor. A single staircase, long buried. but the entrance had been sealed with concrete from the inside. Carved into the last visible step was a sigil, familiar to those who studied the Abbey's strange ledger, a milk droplet circled in gold. They left it untouched. And so, Saint Lisette remained, empty, preserved. A monument to something the church would not name. No birds settled on the roof, no vines overtook the stone. Nothing grew in the soil behind the kitchen, though it was rich and black as ink. Only the wind moved, soft and low, as if still bowing before an altar long since abandoned. And in the vaults of the church the letter still rests, 20 names, 1 line, and the silence that followed. The final prayer never spoken aloud, only returned. It came quietly, as most such things do, not in headlines or proclamations, but in the footnotes of reform. On June 3, 1878, France enacted a new decree. No religious order, cloistered or open, could receive novices, postulants, or children without full state registration and quarterly inspection by civil authorities. The language was plain. The enforcement would be slow. But to those who had been watching, the meaning was clear. It was not a law built from doctrine. It was built from absence. Saint Lisette was never named in the statute. There were no records from its inquest submitted to Parliament. No official inquiry entered into archives. But within certain halls, those who drafted the law referred to it in whispers as the Saint Lisette measure. A private phrase, a shared understanding that some silences were too dangerous to allow again. The village of Écourcheval, once so devout, had by then gone mute on the subject. Locals refused to point to the hill where the abbey stood. Children were taught not to say its name. Farmers claimed their animals grew restless if led too close to the overgrown path. And when one shepherd found a rosary embedded in a tree trunk, wrapped so tightly around the bark that it left an imprint in the wood, he moved his flock 3 towns away and never returned. The abbey itself remained untouched. No attempt was made to repurpose it, no effort to convert it into a school or a hospital. The church deemed it spiritually sealed, a phrase that meant nothing on paper but everything to those who had read the ledgers, seen the hearthbones, or traced the etchings in the wax. Its windows grew black with mold. Ivy climbed its stone in crooked lines but never crossed the chapel threshold. The garden gate rusted shut, the soil behind it turned to clay. And yet the name Saint Lisette surfaced again and again in margins, in diaries, in the nightmares of those who had once stepped foot past its threshold. Historians noticed a pattern. Between 1836 and 1874, the convent recorded 22 initiates. None ever transferred, none returned home, only 2 death certificates were ever filed. And yet no one called it mass disappearance. No one said the word murder, because nothing had been found, nothing but offerings. The law that followed did not acknowledge the cost. It only moved forward. Inspectors now entered convents with notebooks. Registries were audited, backgrounds checked. The quiet immunity once granted to cloistered orders began to fray. Some abbeys closed by choice, others bristled at interference. But none dared defy it openly. Not after Saint Lisette, not after the bells. Privately, in the years that followed, whispers of similar practices surfaced in isolated places. Rituals of silence, scars hidden under robes. Accounts of sisters who spoke in symbols or offered fingers in penance. Each time the church dismissed them as isolated, exaggerated, misinterpreted. But each time the stories echoed what had come before. Saint Lisette was never reopened. It did not burn, it did not fall. It simply waited, a shell without breath, without song, a ruin whose silence hummed louder than any choir. Travelers who dared walk its halls decades later said they felt watched, not with malice but with mourning, as though the walls remembered those who had not returned and still counted softly in the dark. The law remains in place to this day. But laws, like prayers, are only as strong as the silence they try to hold back. And some silences, those stitched in gold, soaked in salt, pressed into wax and bone, do not fade. They wait. They grow. They are not broken by time, only remembered. In the end, nothing stood out. Not at first. There were no gallows, no chains, no screams etched into the walls. Only what was left behind, rows of shoes placed neatly beneath beds that had not been slept in for decades, ledgers marked with initials no longer attached to living names, rosaries broken where the thread gave way, beads scattered like breadcrumbs that led nowhere. The air inside Saint Lisette was still, not abandoned, not desecrated, just paused, like a breath drawn and never released. The silence was not absence, it was presence, heavy, intentional. It lived in the seams of the linens, in the pages of the journals found hidden behind stones, in the places where salt had bled through the cracks. The evil that settled here did not arrive with force. It was woven slowly through prayer, obedience, and repetition. It dressed in white, it folded hands, it whispered penance in the language of suffering. And it taught those within to smile with their eyes closed. Saint Lisette was never declared a crime scene. No one was charged. No one was buried. What happened inside its walls was never named aloud. But we have the remains. We have the shapes carved in stone where bodies once pressed close. We have the journal entries, the etched candles, the red twine and finger bones left behind like receipts. And we have the silence that followed, carefully constructed, devoutly maintained. Because silence is a habit too. It starts with looking away, with trusting the robe more than the voice, with letting discipline hide behind divinity. Over time it becomes harder to speak, harder to ask, harder to believe that something gentle could be cruel, or that something sacred could rot from the inside out. Until finally we accept it, we teach it, we become it. Saint Lisette is gone, but the pattern is not. So we ask now, not with certainty, not with accusation, but with the weight of everything that was never said. How do we recognize harm when it folds its hands in prayer? How do we hear suffering when it's dressed in ritual? And if we were there at that table with no bread, in that choir with no sound, would we have spoken? Would we speak now? Could this happen again?